Main question of the week: what prompted early communities to organize under a king? Things to consider. It's almost like you want to think in dual terms on these. It's like they had this one thing, but this was a difficulty that they encountered. And with many of these points, you can do that, and it allows you to, instead of saying they had rich soil, you can say what kind of soil they had, but also problems that they had. Okay, so things to consider: rich soil, but temperamental flood seasons. Yeah, they had great soil, only after it flooded, and those were not so predictable. And sometimes the floods didn't come at all, so you would have a drought. Sometimes they lasted too long, and so everything would be flooded out. So yes, they had rich soil and they could create a grain surplus, but they had to really watch the sky and have heavy organization just to organize all that labor. Growing into an urban environment, but they need organization. So you have farmers basically with plots that are kind of crowded together, and they just need legal protection. So they're not being exploited by their neighbors and big landholders and that sort of thing. Grain is often at a surplus, but other essential items are scarce, which means they need trade. They need organization, you know. And trade has a lot to do with written language. You could tie that in as well if you wanted. The surrounding land is not fertile. That means the land around the fertile areas. So remember, we're a people of the river, and all your great soil is on each side of the river, whether in Egypt or Mesopotamia. But all the other stuff, you know, after a couple miles outward, it's horrible land. It's really bad land. So you're actually fairly isolated. And when you're isolated, that can be both good and bad. When you're isolated, you can be protected from enemies, you know, a little bit. So Egypt and Sumeria had a little bit of protection, Egypt more so. But if you're isolated, then trade is more difficult. You don't have as much decent land because you have desert on both sides, you know, that sort of thing. And then some real obvious things that you can mention: king and law, king and redistribution of services and products, basically. Okay, those are the main points, and this slide's available online. So let's move forward. Let's compare Sumeria and Egypt. So we'll get into this slide a little bit. We'll get into some images. This is a representation. There's a representation of farmers in Sumeria. You can see what look like date palm, that sort of thing. And if you really extend your imagination, you can see these square plots, and they all have families living on them. All right? These are your farmers. And because the population is so thick, all the good land on each side of the river is going to be used. It's going to be used for something. There's probably not a plot of decent land that isn't used. It would be a big waste, just because of the nature of both Sumeria and Egypt. So you can almost imagine, gosh, you can really imagine that this is like a suburb, right? A modern suburb. You have plots right next to each other. You have neighbors in their backyard. You know, they're talking over the fence. Well, in ancient Sumeria and Egypt, the fence is the canal. Now, these are canals that have to be maintained by the individual farmers. And remember, your early legal codes, early laws, were basically centered around this right here, canals. Like how to dig your canal, what happens if your neighbor digs his canal wrong and as a result floods your own land. You know, what is the repercussion? How much do they need to pay you? You know, that sort of thing. If your neighbor is not maintaining their canal and therefore affects your own, so you're getting bad water, you know, or not much water, well, there's a law for that, and there's a way to prosecute, essentially. Same in Egypt. Flood season, right? With both the Euphrates and the Nile, so Sumeria and Egypt have an annual flood season. Now the comparison here is that Sumeria is a more tumultuous land. The flood season's more unpredictable. You don't know how much you're going to get. The flood could be so bad it floods everything, you know, or there might be none at all because there's a poor rain season in the mountains to the north, because that's where we're getting all this great alluvial soil, or from mountains. In Egypt, The mountains are to the south. The flood seasons are more predictable. A little bit less chaos, a little bit more stability in Egypt. And this will make a difference in how Egypt survives and lasts and builds itself into a kingdom before Sumeria and lasts longer than the kingdoms of Sumeria. When we say they had good soil in Sumeria and Egypt, it's kind of true and kind of not true. Here's why. Your normal soil is horrible until the floods come, and they leave a little bit of topsoil where you can plant, all right? So when people say that Sumeria and Egypt were highly fertile, that's why they became a civilization, it's partially true, partially not true. Their soil was actually horrible. They really didn't have good conditions. But for a limited window, they had super good conditions. But that meant you had to be super organized. You had to have organized labor, basically everything we've been talking about. So you see with this illustration, there's a little layer of topsoil that you can farm on. If, say, floods come again and wash away your topsoil, then you're out of luck. You know, if the water doesn't come at all and you don't get that fresh layer of alluvial topsoil, well, you certainly can't plant anything in the existing horrible soil. And of course, we have a standard growth, harvest, replant, that sort of thing. Spring, harvest, winter, watering, summer flooding, autumn planting. I already mentioned that they're both isolated. This is a ziggurat. The ziggurat is a basic shape you see with early civilizations. Ziggurats are the predecessor to pyramids. You can see it's almost starting to become a pyramid. The Mastaba shape is that basic shape. And over time, people will build on it, and it will become an even bigger ziggurat or an even bigger pyramid. But the reason that this basic structure, whether it's the ziggurat or the pyramid, exists in so many of these early cultures, can anyone guess or tell me why these pyramids exist throughout all these early cultures in this same sort of phase of culture? You know, Aztecs, Mayans, right? We even have on the island of Malta, pyramids, Egypt, ziggurats in Sumeria and Babylon, and so many other places. Why the pyramid? Why the ziggurat? Aside from ancient aliens. Why would that be the case? Does anyone want to venture a guess? Think of terms of architecture. But like, why that shape? Why not why not a tower? Why not aqueduct shaped? Why not a Gothic cathedral? Why not pillars like the Greeks and Romans had? You know, why that basic physical shape? And the probably a good answer for that to go to is that with mass organization, you know, mass labor, and you don't have a highly developed, these are our first civilizations, they don't have highly developed building practices. So they don't have arches. Arch structures, it's basically what creates an open gallery for most buildings throughout, you know, Greek and Roman existence. So early on, you don't get your columns, you don't get your arches, you get that basic solid shape that's predictable, right? If you build a shape that tapers toward the top, less chance of it falling, and it can last for a very, very long time. But it takes a lot of materials. Later civilizations don't want to use a lot of materials or use a lot of labor because they don't have a lot of organized labor. They have to spend lots of money to get labor. But in these early kingdoms, these early civilizations, they're based on organized labor. So you have your king and your ruling families and the priests at top calling the shots. They're literally basically saying, aside from the planting season and harvesting season, in off seasons, these farmers are organized labor for the state, for the king, for the priests, unlike anything you've ever seen. Organized labor, unlike anything you've ever seen. It would have been spectacular. Just to create these early civilizations, it would have taken so much organization of builders and to build these giant projects in the old kingdom of Egypt. Now keep in mind, the great structures in Egypt all come from the old kingdom. They all come from this really early kingdom, not later. They didn't have great building projects later when there was more commerce, when there were more empires about and more coinage even. It's this early period of organized labor that you get these labor-intensive structures, and it's in this early phase that you get shapes like this because, well, Their architectural technology isn't up to par. So you're naturally going to get that shape when you have early, large-scale building projects. And they are labor-intensive. That's why they're generally not repeated after these initially highly organized civilizations come about. So, like I said before, it's all about the farmers, the agrarian economy. Here's an Egyptian fresco. You see people harvesting here with stereotypical Egyptian art. You see people in the granary, inside of a granary, scooping a pile of something, some kind of grain most likely. And you see some other products here. And you almost always have this overseer. Remember, it's highly organized, so there's going to be one, say, leader or foreman for every sort of group of people to oversee them. It's highly organized. Here we have more harvesting. It looks like a big wicker basket they're using. You see something like a sickle or axe where they're chopping down what looks like a tree. Perhaps, not sure what he's doing here, either digging or harvesting. And then you have a real standard image here of a basic early plow and oxen. So you see a lot of artwork from this earlier kingdom. They're focused on agriculture. It makes everything go around. It's about building a surplus of agriculture and then redistributing it. You redistribute this. And that's kind of the big question for today, is why do products and services move to the central leadership? You know, why are all these goods going to the leader and then being redistributed back out? And so that's kind of where we are now. Let's talk about Egypt a little bit in detail. Remember what I said about there's that one period where these great architectural feats are happening in Egypt. It's the Old Kingdom. It's when they're first organizing, when you have to organize your people. When we look at movies and TV and we read novels about the pyramids and organized labor, they talk about huge amounts of human resources that they need to build these pyramids. So it would have been great. But in these other eras, which are theoretically more culturally advanced and even have more advanced architecture and more advanced trade, more advanced use of currency, more advanced economy, they're not building all this amazing architecture. So let's look at the two big ones here. The Great Sphinx. The Great Sphinx is located in the same location as the other one, the Pyramids of Giza. About the same location. They were built at what we think around the same time, this real early period, not later. Okay, these great feats are built then because we have organized labor like this. The Great Sphinx is fascinating. We don't know how old it is. A lot of sort of conservative historians will say around 3000. They're around from 3000 BCE. Some say 5000 BCE. If we do find out that it is 5000 BCE, we have to rewrite Egyptian history because we got it all wrong. And that's okay, that happens. Ancient history is always on the verge of being rewritten, retold from a more truthful light. And sometimes ancient history is rewritten. It certainly is with scholarly journals and that sort of thing. You won't necessarily go to Barnes & Noble and find the latest research. You have to go to academic journals to see the real movements that are taking place. Actual nonfiction you might see at a bookstore is usually a decade or two or more old in terms of their research. Pyramids at Giza, yeah. And originally they were like temple structures. Your basic shape from archaeology is the Mastaba that existed in Sumeria and Egypt. Of course, they would use these inner chambers for sarcophagi to bury people into these pits, have a little bit of statuary. Now, in this Mastaba, even though there's a pit and the person is buried there, people can visit sort of the front area. You might have a statue of the deceased person there. Usually a great leader. And over time, because of this Mastaba shape, builders try to be resourceful. They won't start again. In other words, they'll build right off this Mastaba shape. And so you get something like a ziggurat in stage one. And so if the Mastaba has been built upon, but to a certain extent, it looks like a ziggurat. If it's built up even more, it looks more like a pyramid. Your more advanced shape. A little more difficult to build a pyramid. You have these nice handy steps on the Ziggurat. So all these feats came from this old kingdom, and now you know why, or at least one of the reasons. You have a people of the river, you have annual flood seasons, you have isolation, and you have beer. Let's talk about beer just a little bit. Grain-based societies who don't grow a whole lot of fruit, like grapes in particular, are beer societies, cultures. Cultures who grow mainly grapes, say in other parts of the Mediterranean, like in Greece, they drink wine. And they make fun of people who drink beer, like the Thracians in the north who drink beer to the ancient Greeks. It's more of a barbaric thing. It just depends on where you are. The Egyptians could be a proud folk. And so the beer they had back then was much thicker, much more nutritious. They'd often flavor it with fruit, that sort of thing. So it was a little bit different than now, but very similar. You'd be able to tell probably that it was beer. Aside from that, Egypt was known to be actually more tightly organized. It had a tighter hierarchy than Sumeria. The leader, the pharaoh even, was a direct representation of God. If something went wrong with the annual flood season, it was the pharaoh who fell on hard times. It was the pharaoh who maintained order, or Maat. Maat, here spelled M-A-A-T, is it's a supernatural concept, but it's also a social concept. And it's the order of the universe. And so in Egyptian culture, if you go outside your rank, if you insult someone outside your rank, or you don't do your job, you're breaking the natural order of things, and you disrupt Ma'at, the order of things in the universe. And when you disrupt Ma'at, you go outside your own role, or do something bad, or illegal, then you're bringing a negative supernatural consequence on your family and the rest of Egypt. So when you step out of place, in some ways, of course, that are obvious, like murder, right, or thievery, and some that are not so obvious, like maybe wearing your hair a certain way, or worshiping the wrong deity, or not worshiping on a certain day, or not showing up for your communal labor, or not digging your canal properly. You're disrupting Ma'at. Ma'at is also a female deity in Egypt. And so with so many of these early religions, you really have personifications of ideas. Not only are they nature-based gods oftentimes, but you have social principles that are personified through a god or goddess, and Ma'at is one of those. A lot of times when you read about Ma'at, it's misinterpreted. It's easy to misinterpret it, but it's an exciting concept nonetheless. So if a book calls Ma'at truth, they've really obscured the meaning of it, because it's actually very specific. It has to do with the order of things. And you see that with any society, especially tight-knit collective societies, like certain eras of Chinese and Japanese history. Very tight social roles. You're in for a lot of trouble if you go outside your own role or break a simple moray, right? But very similar here. It keeps order. And in places like Sumeria and Egypt, you have to have order to survive, You have to have tight order to survive. You have to create a surplus of grain. How early Sumerians and Egyptians influenced the modern world? Yeah, this is good stuff. Our calendar. They had a calendar of 365 days a year, 12 months, 30 days. Wow, 365 days a year, 12 months, 30 days. A lot of our time-based and sort of definitely astrological and astronomical ideas, mathematic ideas, really started with Sumeria and Egypt. They were fascinated with the sky, and hopefully you know why at this point. I think that's kind of interesting. So we still use, in a very simple way, this almost similar calendar. We still have 12 months, 365 days a year. Oftentimes our month is 30 days long. They also use 30, 60 time intervals, so half an hour, a full hour is 60 minutes. Very interesting. The Egyptians and Sumerians used this. Most historians tell you the Sumerians came up with it. Fascinating. So these are, 5,000 years old or more? 5,000 years ago. We get our basic ideas around time. Because time could be centered on 10, 100. I mean, it could be 10 and 100 intervals. Okay, conspiracy and fiction. Our culture is inundated with symbols from Egypt, movies, action movies, you name it, Egypt, the pyramids, pharaohs, mummies, the Book of the Dead. They're redoing The Mummy, actually, with Tom Cruise. I don't know. You guys know about that? Fiction heavily influences fiction. It's pretty obvious. You just see it all over the place. Egypt is just that era of the Old Kingdom is more popular than all the other eras because of the pyramids and the Sphinx. Otherwise, we wouldn't even pay attention to Egypt, would we? Really, in terms of pop culture. If it wasn't for the Old Kingdom with the pyramids and the Sphinx, no big deal, unless you're talking about the Book of the Dead, which isn't nearly as well known, but still fascinating. Speaking of the Book of the Dead, we have the afterlife. Sumeria and Egypt were just those early societies that give us commentary on the afterlife, and the Egyptians in particular. One would be buried with the Book of the Dead. So when you're in the afterlife, you can read the Book of the Dead and figure out where to go. You get instructions, A lot of the Book of the Dead has to do with the movement of the soul out of the body. So when you read the Book of the Dead, which is available online, it's very, very entertaining. Some of it's dry, but if you really kind of read through it, it's fascinating what they say about the soul and what it does after the body dies in detail. Very neat. The soul spends 7 days in the deceased body before the soul leaves. So there's certain things you do with the body in those 7 days. You might cry, certain lamentations. There might be songs, certain things you do, depending on the era. We're talking about a long spread of time here. So, ideas about the afterlife. Astrology and astronomy, we went over that quite a bit. New Age and occult influences. Early Sumerian divination, Anatolians in general, and the Greeks and the Romans all got their divination from the Sumerians. The Babylonians had to preserve these ideas, of course, but they got it from the Sumerians. Divination is essentially getting a yes or no response from the gods. So, and we'll talk about this in detail much more later, but divination is reading the birds, reading the sky, reading the patterns of the sacred chickens, slicing open a liver from a bird and looking at the mounds on it. And not really telling the future so much as getting the state of things and if the gods approve. So, should we go to war today? Is this a good day to start this building project? Divination was used for very sort of everyday things. Architecture, they still have 2 of the wonders of the world from the Old Kingdom, that early kingdom with mass organization. That stuff doesn't exist from other kingdoms, from other eras.